So colleagues, good morning and welcome to the Usher Institute's COVID-19 webinar series. My name is Linda Bauld. I'm a professor of public health in the Usher Institute, and this is the 13th in this series of webinars. Now, many of you who are on the are listening today have joined these in the past, so you're familiar with the format, but just bear with me while I take you through that again. We're not able to see the people who are listening, but you will be able to post your questions throughout the webinar, and that needs to be done in the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. I can then follow those questions during the webinar, and we'll ask our speaker a selection at the end. The webinar is being recorded and is being live streamed via YouTube, so if you have any colleagues who are interested and haven't been able to register and join us live, do share that link after the webinar or direct them to the Usher Institute webpage, which will have a PDF of the slides and also a link to the YouTube stream. So I'm really delighted this morning, particularly delighted actually, to be able to introduce my colleague, Professor Naveed Sattar, who's Professor of Metabolic Medicine at the University of Glasgow in the UK. He also continues as an honorary consultant in metabolic medicine at Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and he co-leads a CVD prevention clinic there. He's a fellow of a number of the Royal Colleges, and in relation to COVID specifically, he has been very active in terms of research, assisting with the National Diabetes Audit, and with Public Health England and others, at least 2 papers submitted and under revision in relation to outputs for those in relation to COVID. He's also been helping Ewan Harrison, who many colleagues from Edinburgh will know, with some of their analysis and feeding into using data from the UK Biobank in relation to COVID, diabetes and other topics. So he's an ideal speaker to talk about, I think, what is a very interesting and important theme that we don't fully understand yet, the relationship between COVID-19 and overweight and obesity, looking at risks, realities and research needs. So I'll hand over to you, Naveed, and thank you very much again for joining us.
Okay, I'm hoping you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. Thanks very much, Linda. It's a pleasure to talk about a really important topic. So this is, of course, Glasgow. As you all know, the sun always shines, if only that were true. So these are my disclosures. And before I start, of course, many of you are actually from Scotland, no doubt. Some of you, of course, are from elsewhere. And I'm sure not if, but when we pass this pandemic and you come to beautiful Scotland, this is a hill called Ben Ann, which is kind of halfway between, well, it's not really halfway, but it's within about an hour from both Glasgow and Edinburgh, sort of due north, and it's one of the sort of loveliest hills in the world. And it's only a 45-minute sort of little trek up to the top, and my kids are up there, and my dog's somewhere behind the boulders. Okay, so this pandemic, as you know, has now led to more than 450,000 deaths worldwide. We were caught slightly unawares, at least in the UK, because we thought, I think our modelling was based in part on pneumonia, but the infectivity of this coronavirus has been greater than others. Mortality is 1%, but 1% of many infections is a big number. The good news is that the hospital ITU mortality has been declining from initially 50% down to 25%. As we improve our care and understand how better to manage patients. The big difference between countries has been down into terms of the lockdown timing. We were a bit slow in the UK, as you all know. And of course, and the other factors may be an inherent susceptibility. It may be that some nations, some races, ethnicities have a greater protection from coronavirus because of perhaps prior infections. We just don't know. I think there's a lot we just don't know about this, and we're still learning. My top thoughts actually is the following, actually. So by far the biggest risk factor on the left, I think, is age. It's by far the biggest risk factor, and we mustn't forget that. The other things are that male sex, normally males are around 20 to 30% higher risk of mortality, but in this case, it's about double, so it's higher. In the UK, the actual mortality rates in Blacks and South Asians, or Afro-Caribbeans and South Asians, tend to be lower, but it's been reversed by COVID-19. So it suggests that there's a greater propensity in certain ethnic groups. I think the gradient of deprivation and risk is greater. The gradient of some of the cardiovasculars is either similar or greater. And I think the gradient linked to obesity and mortality is certainly greater in COVID, and I'll show you some of the evidence. And finally, if obesity gradient is greater, then you will not be surprised, particularly that type 2 diabetes gradient to mortality is greater, but also there is evidence for type 1 as well. Now, let me explain it this way. I think we've been caught out slightly because this this virus is not just affecting the lungs like a normal pneumonia. There's a hyperimmune response, which leads to a cytokine storm, which is much greater than the body's needs, and that stresses many organ systems beyond the lungs. It particularly seems to stress, and I'll show you on the next slide, it causes a thrombosis, and it hits the small blood vessels that supply many organs. These blood vessels often are relevant to your cardiac function, your respiratory function, and your kidney function. And it stresses also, because it affects blood supply and oxygen supply, it affects the cardiometabolic and respiratory systems more than normal. So one way to think about this is that many of the mortality risks in COVID-19 are exactly the same mortality risks in general, but some particular pathways are more exaggerated because they are experiencing a bigger hit from the COVID-19 hyperimmune response. And these are particularly cardiometabolic, cardiorespiratory, and blood vessel systems, is my take on it. Just so to put this into context, when if I was enthusiastic and I go on my bike and I'm unlucky enough to get hit by a bus and I end up in ITU tomorrow, my levels of inflammation will be substantially elevated. And for a short period of time, that will actually protect me because, particularly if that inflammation is moderated, I can keep it within check. The sort of cytokine IL-6 and will cause an insulin resistance, it will cause a dyslipidemia, and it will cause coagulation. And these things protect in terms of stopping bleeding, so the coagulation, but they also brain and the immune system. So that's a good thing in normal circumstances. What's happening in COVID is this IL-6 response seems to be massively exaggerated beyond what the body's needs are, and it leads to a substantial hypercoagulation, severe insulin resistance, and it's well beyond the body's needs, and it can cause lots of other problems in terms of blood supply to organs and so forth. Okay, let's get to the outline then. The evidence for obesity as relevant to COVID. What's the evidence? About a few slides. What's the possible explanations? And I'll go through that. And again, it's relatively light touch in terms of, and what the causation. So I'm going to talk about really explanations. One is confining and the other is causation. And it's probably a bit of both. And finally, the implications for care and public health policy, which, as you can all imagine, are not easy, actually. So this, to date, is the biggest data set looking at obesity as an independent risk factor. It was published by Ben Goldacre and his group down in Oxford, including Liam Smith, who's a brilliant colleague and a friend from London School. And it was based on electronic health records of 17 million adults in the NHS. Now, it's not by far, I would not say it's accurate completely. But if you look at the red box, so compared to non-obese, if you're obese 30 to 35, the hazard ratio is 1.54, falls to 1.27 in the multivariate model on the right. And you can see it goes up sort of linearly up to threefold with a BMI above 40, down to 2.27 in multivariate hazard ratio. Now, there's caveats here because many patients without in National Health Service do not have the BMIs. There's also caveats that within the non-obese category, there's a kind of U-shaped, and I therefore think these are possibly underestimates of the association. And how you do these analyses really matters in terms of missing this and considering reverse causality as well. Other reports in New York, in those who are less than 60, compared to those compared to those who were less than 60 and had a BMI below 30, the risk for critical care who had COVID-19 was 1.8 times higher if you had a BMI 30 to 34, or 3.6 times higher if you had a BMI 35 and above. And that was a paper published this year. This is probably another study. It's a retrospective study from France and 124 ITU patients, published again this year. If I take you to the top left, I hope you can see my cursor. Again, the darker the box, the higher the BMI. You can see the relevant categories. Dark is BMI above 35. You can see those who had a positivity for SARS-CoV-2 were much more likely to be heavier in the first place. There's a greater preponderance of high BMI groups and a very small preponderance of a BMI below 25, probably less than 25%. If you go to the right, this is the risk within those people who tested positive of then being pushed forward to mechanical ventilation. Again, you can see there's many more dark boxes, so there's a greater preponderance of high BMI above 35, above 30, and indeed above 25, compared to those who did not go to require mechanical ventilation. And if you compare within each category, so the bottom on the right-hand side, if you had a BMI of 35 and greater and you had a positivity for SARS-CoV, you had almost a sort of 86% chance of requiring mechanical ventilation. On the other side, if your BMI was less than 25 and you developed, you had SARS, you had a positivity for SARS-CoV-2, you had a less than 50% chance of requiring mechanical ventilation. So the odds ratio that follows BMI above 35 compared to 25 requiring mechanical ventilation was 7.4, substantially elevated. These are data we've just put online onto a preprint, as you can see, and it's from UK Biobank. When we first looked at this a couple of weeks ago, there was no mortality data, but there are mortality data now. So the top left box is actually the BMI, and it's the relative risk for COVID-19 in hospital testing. And again, as you can see, it's a straight line upwards from 21, both below 70 and above 70. So just getting a positivity in hospital, which probably tells you some degree of severity, there's a straight line up, and possibly once you get to a BMI 40, the hazard ratio is around about threefold. Having said that, now these are kind of preliminary data. The number of deaths are modest, but still, I think, reasonable. If you look at below 70 versus above 70, that actually you see that there's a much stronger gradient in relation to BMI and the risk for COVID death. If you are under 70 and have a BMI, say, of 35, the hazard ratio seems to be around about fivefold, compared to if you're over 70, it seems to be about 2.5-fold. Now, I would remind you that BMI is a much more accurate measure of body fatness in younger people. Once you get beyond a certain age, you start to lose muscle mass. There's what's known as reverse causality due to chronic disease, and therefore BMI is a less accurate measure of total body fatness in older people, and therefore in younger people the accuracy is better, and it's probably a true reflection of the link between fatness and risk. And then if you go to the bottom two curves, here we've looked at white and non-white. Actually, I can tell you on the left-hand side, it was the same for South Asians. If you are clearly, you can see the relative risk for COVID-19 in hospital. The gradient for non-white seems to be substantially stronger than in whites, both for COVID positivity in hospital and preliminary data for COVID-19 deaths. The number of deaths were modest, so I think take this with a degree of caution. But there's only one place I've seen figures like this, and you'll see it in the next couple of slides, and it's in relation to diabetes. The risk of diabetes in non-whites is the gradient of BMI to risk is far greater, as you will see. So this kind of thinks maybe there's something metabolic going on here, or factors related to metabolism, which I'll explain. What about the possible explanations? Let me come on to it. Well, before you get saying, well, look, my God, the evidence is so clear-cut, it must be causal, you've got to be slightly careful. There is confounding by obesity and deprivation. Obesity leads to more infections in the first place, it might well do, and so more chances to develop severe outcomes. So that might be a possibility. If you think about it, if you live in such an environment, there's less physical distancing, there's smaller houses and smaller rooms, you can have flats and tenements, and therefore you have to, you're much more likely to meet people as you enter and leave, your area, your place of residence. You probably spend more time out indoors because it's not as attractive to spend time outdoors, and there's other reasons as well. So there is a kind of confounding factor that we need to think about. This was published yesterday, just to give you an idea, that corona hotspots across Edinburgh and across Glasgow. Certainly I'm familiar with Glasgow, but nearly all of the spots that you see are some of the most deprived communities that we have in Glasgow, such as Postle Park, Springburn, Drumchapel, Parkhead West, etc., etc. And in Edinburgh, the fair city of Edinburgh, which I hate to say I love as well, but don't tell the other Glaswegians to do that. But clearly, there's places that you're familiar with which have got poverty, but there are also, I think Liberton West and the Grange and other places. I wonder if some of these are care homes, but certainly Joppa, some parts of Leith, etc., etc. There's both poverty and there's probably care home relationships there. Again, if you look at the UK in general, you all know that deprivation and obesity go hand in hand. On the left is the more red is more deprivation. On the right, the more red is more obesity. And actually, although we don't have Scotland, but you can see that here, there's more sort of dark red, and it's just there. I think it's kind of the northeast, and again, around about these areas are broadly similar. The dots appear almost in identical places. So obesity and deprivation go hand in hand. And there's more aspects about deprivation than just obesity. So there's poor diet, there's quality of diet, there's social aspects that might be relevant to how fast the virus is spread and how much viral load individuals get. So just be mindful of those kind of potential confounders. Now, if it is causal, remember there are many complications of obesity. This is just a snippet, but excess fat gets into various organs, which I'll show you in the next slide, into the liver. Liver disease then causes dyslipidemia around blood vessels and hypertension. It affects the lungs because of physical aspects, splinting and etc. And clearly that's relevant when you get COVID-19. And it also affects venous stasis and thrombosis. So you kind of get the element now that maybe it's already priming us that obesity is actually increasing our susceptibility to the pathways that COVID-19 is particularly affecting. We did an early paper on this with my two brilliant colleagues, Ian McInnes and John McMurray, and it's a pleasure always to write with them because John McMurray and Ian often rewrite my poor grammar, which is fine. But they also add a huge value. So obesity and excess ectopic fat. One, it could be that actually there's a couple of links. One, if it's causation, that there's a dysregulated hyperimmune response because of fat cells per se, because fat cells, as I'll show you in the next slide, make cytokines. Two, when you're more overweight and obese, we know from the flu virus, you shed more viruses and you have a bigger viral load in your breath. Now, so therefore, if you're more overweight and obese and you live in an environment where there's more overweight and obese people, there might be greater viral load in the environment, particularly in the context of smaller houses. That might lead to greater viral exposure and therefore a bigger hyperimmune response. For the given level of immune response, you need to be able to buffer that, your body systems. And if, for example, you are more overweight and obese, as I've already told you, it affects the lungs, so you cannot put as much oxygen into your lungs. Obesity affects your cardiorenal systems, your blood pressure, your thrombogenic potential, and increases diabetes. And therefore, you have lower cardiorespiratory fitness, you increase susceptibility to immune-driven vascular effects and thrombotic effects, and you have an impaired metabolic response. So you might have two things going on, both in terms of the actual level of hit and the inability to cope with that hyperimmune hit because of obesity. This is an early paper. I'm proud of it because I think we're broadly correct, but we need a lot more studies to elaborate on these things. Now, let me take you a bit further, just for those of you who are interested in basic science. So this is a nice paper in 2014, lent to me by Ian McInnes. So lean, insulin sensitive on the left, fewer inflammatory cells, but when you become obese and insulin resistant, you have more what's known as M1 macrophages, more neutrophils, so more kind of pro-inflammatory signals. So fat is a source of systemic and local inflammatory cytokines and adipokines. It resets the immunological rheostat, and therefore you can see how that there might be a direct interaction between the virus and fat to lead to an exaggerated immune response. Now, to be honest with you, we're just scratching the surface of this. The immune sort of area of expertise and the obesity expertise, they've crossed in terms of research in a small amount, but there's a lot more work to be done. And we're hoping to do some of this work in Glasgow, looking at fat tissue from patients with COVID-19 and looking at the functionality in relation to the virus. Diabetes is a disease of ectopic fat, by and large. By and large, it's ectopic fat is what causes diabetes. And this is a model that Jason Gill and I put together. Roy Taylor and I and colleagues have done better with Mike Lean with the direct study and taken it further. But we all have a set threshold beyond which we will put fat into, we'll spill over fat beyond our subcutaneous tissue into our liver, into muscles, pancreas, around our blood vessels. This will lead to abnormal lipids, fluid gain, and higher blood pressure. And in those people who are susceptible, and I put my hand up, I'm one of them. The reason I know I'm susceptible is because I'm South Asian and because I'm male and because both my parents had type 2 diabetes. And therefore, when I put on enough weight, I will develop, beyond severe insulin resistance, high sugar levels because my pancreas will not be able to cope. And we know that high sugar levels are bad because they affect your increases infection risk. And we know that high sugar levels and poor immune function, pure metabolism leads to poorer immunity. So there's a link there as well. Let me take it even further. So imagine you have an individual now who has high sugar levels for a number of years. And they've then been diagnosed with diabetes, because diabetes 20 years ago was diagnosed about 10 years after people had high sugar levels. So high sugar levels, and for those of you, Linda will recognize this, this is a favorite tipple. Actually, I'm just kidding, it's not. This is sticky toffee pudding. And why is it called sticky? Because sugar is sticky. When you put sugar, for those of you who know, in fact, I'm sure you all know, if you put water on sugar, it starts to become very sticky. And the same thing happens in the body. High sugar level sticks to various things, proteins, and it sticks to particularly small blood vessels and causes them to clog up, so that you get retinopathy, kidney disease, neuropathy, look at that poor foot, and erectile dysfunction, and many other small vessel function. Small vessels that supply the heart may be affected as well. And small vessels are particularly affected in type 1, particularly once you've had it for many years compared to type 2. And in the paper we published online, the excess risk in type 1 for COVID was threefold. For type 2, it was twofold. And these papers are in revision with the journal. And there's similar data coming out of Scotland, led by Helen Cahoon, who's a brilliant colleague, from Edinburgh, and includes many other fantastic Scottish colleagues. So metabolism. And then if you didn't believe me in terms of the BMI diabetes link, here it is. So look, by the time you get to 35, BMI 35 compared to 21, the hazard ratio is not 2 to 3-fold, it's 50-fold in men. In South Asians, that curve is to the left, and therefore South Asians are, and even Afro-Caribbeans and Chinese are more obese for a lower BMI. They carry more fat tissue, and that's why their risk is higher. Lung function with weight gain. This is a lovely paper published in Thorax. I know that Aziz Sheikh isn't able to join, but Aziz would tell us this quite clearly. Notice this is a force on the sort of y-axis, FVC, your ability to kind of push air out, which is a measure of the ability to take air in. And it's broadly similar at 20, maybe slightly higher and more overweight because they're bigger bodies. But notice the orange, sort of that orange curve is the most obese individuals. And notice their ability to take in oxygen or air falls much more rapidly over time, beyond 40, 50, 60, it falls faster, whether you're overweight, normal weight, and obese. And particularly in obese individuals already, notice their fall off is substantial. So obesity affects your ability to take in oxygen into your lungs. It also affects and enlarges your heart. This is a paper that I published, and it's led by a brilliant colleague called Annika Rosengren from Sweden, from Gothenburg, and I helped them a little bit with this paper. But look at the middle curve, BMI from about 18 up to 40, and the hazard ratio of dilated cardiomyopathy up to about 16-fold higher. And this is BMI measured at adolescence and followed for 20, 30 years. So obesity affects the lungs beyond just, and these are people beyond having an MI. There's an effect on cardiac remodeling of obesity. And the pathway is the following. I'll just go in a simple fashion. It's not just atherogenesis as we traditionally thought, but obesity, with or without diabetes, causes fluid retention, fluid in the wrong places that stresses the nephrons of your kidneys, and you get a backflow of fluid that stresses the heart. So you get a sort of a volume hemodynamic glomerular stress, as it were. And if you want to read this, Dan McGuire and I wrote this little piece. And there's lots more happening now in this space from people in the diabetes space. BMI also affects, this is a sort of a Mendelian randomization led by Stephen Burgess from Cambridge and Swedish colleagues. notice heart failure. This is causal for heart failure, for deep vein thrombosis, hypertension, etc., etc. You can see it. And then thrombosis. I've told you about thrombosis. Again, this Annika Rosengren was, again, they've got brilliant data in Sweden, as you know. This is the prevalence of a venous thromboembolism, so VTE. Notice if you're normal weight, it's by the time you get to 50, you'll be very unlucky. Maybe one in 40 people. So it's about 2%. Is that right? Yeah, 1 in 50. You're lucky. If you might have a venous thromboembolism. If you've got a BMI 35 to 60, it's almost 1 in 10. A BMI 30 to 35, probably be about 7%, so about 1 in 14. So linear links between venous thromboembolism and obesity. So if I put all of this together, this is my take on it. If you're lean and you get the severe COVID-19 reaction, or so the threshold is up here in the red. If you're lean and you get the hit, the immune hit, you might increase your risk, but because your risk is low to begin with, you don't get there. If you're obese, you're closer to the threshold to begin with, and any degree of hit leads you to that. So that might be one model. The alternative is the following, is that not only are you closer to begin with, but that the actual level of hit is substantial, more substantial. You get an exaggerated response in the first place. And that exaggerated response on the back of blood vessels that are more furred up and have a greater propensity to thicken, heart and lungs which are less plastic and in a sense, they've aged cardiometabolically, they've aged, your metabolism has aged, and your immune function has aged. All of these things lead your inability to cope with this, and you get an exaggerated response, and you're more likely to hit the threshold for mechanical ventilation and, sadly, mortality. The final bit I want to talk about, vitamin D. Vitamin D's hit the headlines, but did you know that obesity lowers vitamin D? And the answer is yes, it does. A beautiful paper led by colleagues in Australia, Elna Hipponen, and using, again, Mendelian randomization. As the BMI score goes up, you get effects on vitamin D synthesis and metabolism. So obese people who are more overweight, have lower vitamin D levels. And their point was population levels to reduce BMI might reduce the prevalence of vitamin D deficiency. I'm not sure if that's necessarily correct, but the point being is that low vitamin D is not necessarily on its own. It's so heavily confounded by smoking, BMI, social class. It's also an acute phase reactant. So don't believe everything you hear about vitamin D. And in fact, the first paper that was published looking at vitamin D and risk for COVID, not necessarily for mortality, although Claire's looking at this right now, and we're probably going to write this up. Vitamin D concentration in COVID, we found no evidence that vitamin D linked levels measured, albeit 10 years ago, to future infection risk or explain higher ethnicity risk. So I would not put your mortgage on vitamin D being a protective element for COVID-19, even though there is some evidence that it protects against acute respiratory infections. The only way you're going to get there is going to be randomized trials. That's the only way we get to the truth. And you must be mindful of that. Don't believe the hype in terms of associations. And I would say 99% of the literature on vitamin D and associations is absolute nonsense. So just be very, very careful. Other things, other diseases that link to COVID. And again, I've highlighted the ones that I want you to think. Diabetes, the risk is higher than you would expect for mortality, but twofold. Type 1 is threefold. Chronic liver disease, which is linked to obesity. Cardiac disease, stroke and dementia. Obesity is a risk factor for dementia. Reduced kidney function, obesity is a risk factor for that. Asthma is not such a strong risk factor. And there are a few other things, malignancies, but that's obviously because of, if you have malignancy, that really affects your thrombotic potential as well, and organ transplants and immunity and so forth. So, can we link it to ectopic, to male and excess risks? Yeah, the answer is yes. Did you know that men get not only more heart disease, but they also get more diabetes in middle age, and they get more liver disease? This is a paper that we led in UK Biobank, led by my excellent PhD colleague, who's actually, she's got a Viva today, actually. In every ethnicity, more men get diabetes than women, just for age, sex, deprivation. They also get more liver disease, more heart disease. And this is why, because actually at every age, men have to put on less weight across the life course than women to develop diabetes. It's because you put fat in the wrong places, in inverted commas, to begin with, compared to women. And you see the same in South Asians and blacks. This is a paper I'm very proud of, actually. Again, we did this using CPRD, led by my colleagues Martin Rutter and various other colleagues, and Alison Wright and I helped them write this, actually co-led this, and effectively this is the weight differential to develop diabetes at different ages. If you're 20 to 39 and you're white, you have to be 24 kilograms heavier, which is about 8 units of BMI, compared to the general population to develop type 2 diabetes. By the time you get to 80, it's about 4 or 5. I think that's slightly exaggerated. However, if you're South Asian or Black in UK, the same age, you only have to be 12 to 16 kilograms heavier. And by the time you get to 50 to 59, which is my age, I know that's hard to believe, but it certainly is. So South Asian who have diabetes compared to those South Asians at 50 who don't, they are only about 5 kilograms heavier. So very susceptible to small weight gains to develop diabetes. That means there's a lot more pre-diabetes out there. That means many more South Asians probably have poorer cardiorespiratory fitness because they've got fat in the wrong places. And therefore, if they get a virus, they're more likely to lead to frank diabetes because of the immune response and have that hit. If you don't take it a bit further, look at this. This is the age of onset of diabetes, and the kind of throughout the population. Purple is whites and Blacks and South Asians. Look at the numbers who develop diabetes, or the percentages, in under 50, many, many more. And notice there is a greater risk of younger Blacks and South Asians for COVID-19. And that would mean more microvascular disease in non-whites, because if we get diabetes earlier, we have a longer time for hypoglycemia to affect our blood vessels because it's sticky, as it were. Last bit. So we've got 9 minutes to talk about implications for care. So I'm going to slow down. I think you get it now. You get the fact that COVID-19, this virus, hyperimmune response beyond the lungs, and it affects small blood vessels that supply the heart, the kidneys, and therefore affects oxygen supply. And therefore, if you have poor lungs to begin with, poor lung function, poor metabolism, because you need metabolism to put fuel to the right places, poor immunity, a poor cardiac function, poor blood vessel function, you're much more likely to succumb. And that's what we're finding. And if you're male, because you have more of those things, you're more likely to succumb. And if you're South Asian or Black, you have more of those issues, and you're therefore more likely to succumb. And that's what the evidence shows. So what are the implications for care and public health policy? Do we need to prove obesity is causal for excess risk? The answer is probably still yes, but I think there's enough evidence to suggest we shouldn't wait. And we should really try to help people lose weight. Going forward, improve public health messaging to help people improve lifestyle. People don't want to be obese or overweight. It's very hard. We need sustainable increases in activity. I hope, ideally more people are cycling and walking, sustainable reductions in calorie intake, and to substantially lessen the chances. The good news is, if you've got pre-diabetes, losing 3 to 4 kilograms can delay diabetes by 3-4 years, 2 to 3-4 years. We can also reverse diabetes. In the direct study, 10 kilograms weight loss led to diabetes reversal. I'll skip that. This is how we did it in the direct trial led by Mike Lean and Roy Taylor. People lost 14 kilograms and using low calorie diets on the right. And over the course, 46% had diabetes remission. We've also got expensive drugs now called semaglutide, GLP-1 receptor agonists, and these are being trialed, but they're very expensive. 10 to 15 kilograms of weight loss, which is great. And we've got resources. We've got commercial weight loss companies that do well. They've got online resources. There's Couch to 5K. But having said that, not everyone is going to access that. And the kind of people who are at the moment being more active and probably trying to eat better are not those who are most at risk, I would have to say. It's just a sad reality fact that those who are finding it hardest to make lifestyle changes or even considering them are those who are at the highest risk in poorer communities. And there's lots of confusion about diet as well. As an example of this, if I would say to you, is a sugar tax going to reduce obesity? And the answer is yes, it is. But is sugar the reason for overweight? And the answer is no. This is a lovely paper that we again did in UK Biobank, and Jill Pell she's a really good, great, fantastic colleague, and Jana Anderson led this along with many of us, and it's a brilliant team of all fantastic colleagues. we've all got fantastic colleagues, I hate to say. So sugar, as the quintiles of BMI went up, of intake went up for sugar, the BMI went up. And that was adjusted for age, sex, and ethnicity. And then we adjusted it for physical activity. So you can see there's a link between sugar, starch, and excess fat, and higher BMI on the kind of y-axis. But because they all provide calories, you have to adjust for total energy intake. So once we adjust for total energy intake, what did you find? Well, the only one that remained positive was fat. This is in UK Biobank. It suggests that most people who are overweight or obese are still gaining most of their excess calories, not necessarily from sugar or starch, but from fat. Now, I'm not saying this is the perfect answer, but it's to make the point that there's still quite a lot of confusion in the community. And people think, well, often they think sugar's the cause of my diabetes and that's the reason I'm fat. And the answer is no. Lots of people getting excess calories from a range of things, not just sugar, but also fat and starch and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not expecting you to read this, but I wrote a paper with Jason Gill and a colleague called Will Alazawi, who's a hepatologist in London. And it was in Nature Medicine, and it's not been picked up because it was published probably the day that we went into lockdown. So I'm not sure it will be picked up that much, but I think it's pretty decent, but I would say that. And my major points along with Jason was that we need to simplify the evidence for people. We need to make it, I think we need to make a simple written leaflet, which is one page, that tells you the evidence-based options and what to do. We have to make it very prescriptive. And we've done that actually, and we're about to submit that next week. I wrote it with Jason, NHS colleagues, dietitians, and also colleagues from public health in Glasgow, Cindy Gray, who's brilliant, and Stuart Gray. So this one page, and I think that's what we should do. And I'm not saying it's for everybody, but we need at this moment to give people something, because at the moment, because of lockdown, because of social distancing, we're not having GP visits as normal, we're not having clinic visits as normal, and a lot of people are putting on weight in the lockdown, we really are. And then same with activity, simplify the message, 1,000 extra steps per day. I know you know this, 10 minutes extra walking, find activities that give pleasure, etc., etc., etc. Resistance exercise, which is a tool, and we need to improve that messaging. Look, back to Ancel Keys. He basically said, an epidemic under the right economic and social circumstances, obesity from overeating will be a dominant nutritional problem. Now you think, who's Ancel Keys? And that's obvious. Well, he said that in 1949. And here's a deep fried Mars bar. For those of you outside Scotland, this comes from Edinburgh, not Glasgow. Honestly, it's not. I'm just joking. It's a myth, actually. But so there you go. And actually, these problems are going to worsen potentially. The environment has become more obesogenic, so we need to make it less. It's going to be really tough. And the other really big thing, I think, is the biggest problem by far in this country. And my sense is partly why we've done worse, we locked down too late, and also because I'm not being political, but in a sense it's a political point. We need quality education for all. Only by improving people's education will we actually improve their understanding of lifestyle, give them a better horizon so that they want to improve their lifestyles in the first place. And where we failed in this country, we have absolutely failed, and that's what we need to do. I'm not optimistic. In the food and retail industry, last 2 or 3 slides, half the story. This is Annie Anderson sort of wrote this, and I borrowed it from her. We need to increase healthier options, range of portion sizes, promote good quality fruit and veg, which is cheaper, because this stuff at the moment costs lots of money, and poorer people in poorer societies can't access stuff that looks and tastes nice. We also need to decrease, at the same time, less healthy options, large portion sizes, and confectionery. At least a level playing field, as Annie told me, and she's correct. So my last slide, I think we're bang on time. What have I told you? Well, I've told you that COVID-19 severity, death is linked to obesity and ectopic fat. The links appear strong, and I can also tell you that we've looked at COVID and non-COVID deaths in National Diabetes Audit, and obesity is much more strongly linked to COVID deaths than it was to non-COVID deaths. So that provides further evidence. It could be partly confounding, but I think it's true because of the pathways I've told you. It's linked to microvessels, thrombosis, inflammation, all the hearts and lungs. The points that this virus and the hyperimmune response, the cytokine storm hits, and that partly explains the excess risk in males, in non-whites, through to diabetes, etc., etc. I think it doesn't fully explain it. There are other aspects, maybe cultural, social, but I think there's definitely a causal element. Can we lessen risk by weight loss? I think we probably can. But even if we can't, weight loss is still going to benefit people. We need greater help to help people lose weight. We need to reduce deprivation. That's going to be very difficult, as the pandemic is going to lead to more poverty, not less. We need to work on the food industry, but the economy, partly depends on the food industry, so there's a conflict. And we need really, what can we do now? I think we need a simple advice urgently, a one-page, simple steps, and we're about to submit that next week, and I'd be happy to share that with colleagues if you think it's valuable, to allow people to start thinking, what can we really try now? And we need to allow people to embrace failure, to try and to make it in a way that they really get that even one or two simple changes, which might take them a few weeks to embed, could be done and could lead to a point where they enjoy it. There's no tension in their life to make that change over a period of time, and that they then succeed and then they can try something else. Because at the moment, the way we've taught lifestyle change, I don't think has been optimal at all. So I'll be happy to stop there and take any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you ever so much indeed, Naveed. I'm afraid to say poor Linda, our chair for the day, has had some internet problems, so she's actually had to drop off the call. She's doing her best to rejoin, but in the meantime, I'm afraid you've got me posting some questions to you from the people here. So we've had lots of questions come in. I have to say, having lived in Edinburgh for quite a number of years yet, I've still not tried a deep fried Mars bar, so I don't think it really is an Edinburgh thing that way.
I was just joking, of course.
Jump into some of these questions here. So we've got a question from Richard Simpson here asking whether you suggest that we should not be treating the BAME community as a single entity, given the fact that there's perhaps a difference with Southeast Asians. Is that quite a few BAME related questions here?
Yeah, no, I know. I think if it's the Richard Simpson, I think that's a very good question, Richard. I don't know. I mean, if you look at the evidence from the ONS, the highest risk community was actually the Bangladeshis. That's where the biggest report. And if you then ask me which ethnic subgroup has the highest risk of diabetes, it's the Bangladeshis. So the Bangladeshis get diabetes earlier, sooner, faster. So I think, and then the second is Pakistanis and the third is Indians. And it looked like the gradient was Bangladeshis followed by South Asians and blacks, and who have similar, and Pakistanis. And so that broadly fits with my sense that diabetes is part of this puzzle, actually. And one of the papers that Ewan has just put together today that's come out online, it was on the BBC website, was that part of the explanation for the higher risk in South Asians was partly diabetes, actually, for greater deaths in hospital. So I think diabetes is part of the puzzle. So I don't know if Richard had a further question, but we can follow that offline, but that I think is part of the puzzle.
There's a related question incoming from Lawrence Gruen here, Grewer, asking if you've got any explanation for why those people potentially have higher risk of diabetes?
Oh yeah, I can. So hello, Lawrence. Lawrence says, we wrote a paper with Lawrence about 10 years ago, and he, it was the ABC of obesity, and Lawrence is he's a fantastic mentor of many of us. So Lawrence, yes, I do. And that paper we just published in Diabetologia is true. So simplistically speaking, the South Asian community have a different engine. We have smaller muscle mass and we carry more fat tissue. And that's how we're born. And it might be something to do with programming, but it also might be something to do with actually, the kind of feast or famine in the past, that you carry more fat to be able to overcome periods of starvation. And we have smaller muscles. Now, the good, interesting thing is Nish Chakravarti, with using UK Biobank, and I've helped with this paper, it's gone submitted to I would say to a good journal. I think it deserved a better journal. It suggests that the second generation South Asians have a lower risk, and partly why? Because they're growing slightly taller, they have slightly smaller waist hip circumferences, and I suspect their early nutrition is changed, and because they get less infections, the nutrition that the kids get, and they get less infections, their growth is slightly greater, bigger muscles. And as soon as you get bigger muscles, you burn off more fuel, and you therefore carry less fuel. So your body composition changes. I think that's what's happening second generation. So it's to do with body composition, Lawrence. And I'm happy to send you a paper Jason Gill and I wrote, 2015 Lancet Diabetes, and I think it's spot on the nail. It's composition.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, this is sort of related and connected, I guess. There's a query here just looking for some clarification. Is the link just primarily type 2 diabetes, or is it both types of diabetes?
Yeah, it's both type, but here's the caveat. I think the evidence is going to show, and I'm talking slightly ahead. So we've got this paper in, actually we've already put it online, so I can talk about it. It was put online by Public Health England, but they're being revised. It looks, so if you followed what I said, small blood vessels. Now, type 1 is high sugar levels from a young age, but they don't necessarily tend to be obese and so forth. So it takes a while for individuals with type 1 to develop what's known as a cardiometabolic or cardiovascular hit, maybe into the 50s, 60s, by the time they've had type 1 for 30 to 40 years. So in early type 1, 20, 30, there's no real major excess risk. That excess risk only happens when they've had it for about 3 to 4 decades, during which the sugar levels, if they've kept high, have started to affect the small blood vessels. And then I think the type 1 risk escalates faster. So overall, the type 1 risk is higher, but threefold for mortality than type 2, but it's predominantly in older people with type 1, not young people. So people who are parents of type 1 shouldn't worry. If they keep the sugars controlled well and keep the risk factors, they'll do fine. For type 2, I think the risk goes up slightly higher earlier, but doesn't go up as steeply, if that makes sense, because your sugars, because usually type 2 develops at 50 to 60, not at 14. So there's a kind of, and people miss all of these nuances. And here's an advert. I'm doing an award lecture at the EASD in September, and it'll probably be online. And I'm going to explain the heterogeneity of diabetes and why people get it all wrong. And it's to do with timing and risk factors. And yeah.
Fantastic. Okie dokie. So moving on then to what we should do about it. There's a couple of related questions here. One from Anthony Tutor and a related one from Malcolm Dunlop, asking what we should be doing. Should we declare a public health emergency? Should we be taxing the calorie? What should we do to try and tackle obesity?
So is that Malcolm from Glasgow? Yes. Hi, Malcolm. How are you doing? So if it's Malcolm that we're hoping to work with brilliant ITU colleagues. So what should we do about it? Oh, God. Is that what the question was, actually?
Yeah.
It's difficult. I'm worried, actually, and I think many of you are, because the economy that keeps me up at night. I'm worried about, I'm even worried about, my own kids' futures, and, I'm reasonably well off and affluent. When you think of the poor, the people who don't have jobs, who've lost their jobs, I'm massively worried that we're going to become poorer. I think we need a whole shift in the UK to I don't want to make a political point, but you know what I'm saying. We really need to invest in better education in the poorer communities. I don't know how we do that. I don't know whether we pay teachers. We need to, pay teachers better, as they do in Finland. Education is part of this, but also part of it is actually improving the food environment. And another part of it is, as I said at the very end, that Nature Medicine paper, and I hopefully we're going to get this leaflet out. I have, with Jason Gill and various colleagues, I've written a one-page leaflet that gives 12 things that people can do now. And we've not said do all 12 things. What we've said is choose one, and here's what you do. It's not saying stop this. It's basically saying replace this with this, and that it might take a bit of time for you to learn to do that. So people actually understand. So, for example, replace sugary drinks with water or a low-calorie drink, and it might take you a while. Cut your sugar out your tea and coffee, and cut on alcohol, or have a salad with every main meal at night, and put half your plate with salad. And why? Because it bulks you up and fills you up. And the point being is, people there are some people who don't eat salad, is that if they get good quality salad, people can enjoy salad. I'll give you a quick anecdote. Two of my colleagues in Glasgow were technicians, and I was mumbling about this leaflet, and they didn't believe me. And so I gave them it. And one of them started eating salads, and 3 months later, and she came in and she showed me her little box. She said, "Look, I've got this salad. And guess what? I actually love this stuff now, and I never believed I would. And it tastes wonderful." And she never knew that salad could taste so nice, or a range of things. But the thing I explained to her was that it might take her a bit of time to get used to the texture and taste of this. So it's almost explaining to people the small journeys that they need to make, and that journey, even though it might be hard, the view at the top is going to be brilliant in the sense that you'll enjoy something new. So that then it becomes sustainable.
Sounds a bit more complicated than taxing sugars.
Yeah, exactly. You know, taxing sugars is part of it, but it's much more than that. And I think we need to explain to people these small choices. And even, you know, I'll give you another anecdote. Fiber-rich cereal or brown bread versus white bread. I mean, you can talk about fat and low carb if you want, but the point is, I'm at the point in my life now, you know, with my diabetes risk, I had to make changes, and it's easier to talk about your own experiences. I now love shredded wheat, would you believe? When I first started, it was cardboard, but now I love the taste and texture. Okay, I add 4 or 5 grapes, but that's enough. And it's full of fiber and it bulks me up, you know, and I enjoy it. And if I enjoy it, I'll sustain it. And that's the thing we need to get to other people. You have to enjoy something to be sustainable. Otherwise it becomes, you know, you fall off the wagon.
Yeah. Fantastic. Now, Linda's joined us back again. So I don't know, Linda, do you want to carry on from here?
Yeah, apologies, Naveed. The whole home internet crashed for everybody, which caused chaos throughout the household. That's never happened before. Anyway, have you talked, has anybody asked you yet about simple messaging? So in terms of how can we, I think you've covered fruit and vegetables, etc. But is there anything else you want to say on the policy front?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, I've never really managed to sit down with politicians in this, Linda, but I would love to. You know, I've learned a lot from a range of colleagues around Scotland who are brilliant, you know, in their own charismatic way. You know, there's a huge number, you know, Mike Lean, there's, you know, Annie. I've worked with people down south in randomized trials in this area, Susan Jebb, Roy Taylor. So I've gained a lot. I've also got a sense of where the issues are. I don't understand the politics of it. Actually, I do understand, you know, a big part of our economy in Scotland, sadly, is the service industry. And there's a conflict here, Linda. I don't, you know, so, you know, we're not going to solve this overnight. And I don't know how that's going to play out because of the pandemic. It's going to be really tough, actually, Linda. What I can say, and I've just said it there to the previous answer, what we can do is improve our messaging. You know, and I think I mentioned to you about a year ago, I mumbled that I was writing a 1-page leaflet, and I finished that. I haven't published it because I thought it's not going to, but actually I think that we do now need that in our clinics, particularly now many of them have gone virtual, and we're not, you know, lifestyle advice is easier to give when people are face to face, but we really need to give some people something tangible that most of them can do in their houses. And the thing I probably forgot to say, there was a talk at the American Diabetes Association, and I never fully understood, and it's clear cut. It's hard to lose weight and sustain weight loss once you get to a certain BMI. It's easier if you're starting to put on weight to stop weight gain. It's much easier physiologically, signals. So I think we need to give this kind of 1-page leaflet to anybody who's interested in the weight and say, here is some tips to help you stop putting on weight, to stay the same weight, maybe lose 2 or 3 kilograms, or maybe, you know, sustainably change. And I don't think we've done that messaging well enough. And I'm hoping we can get this thing published. And if we can improve on it with continuous improvement methodology, as Mike Lean keeps telling me. And maybe we can get it out to, you know, the whole of our colleagues for primary care, secondary care, and build upon it. You know, we're going to try and get it out and then discuss it with my GP colleagues and then patients and see what they like about it and then improve it. And then I think that's what we should do.
Yeah, I think we have to align the communicable disease and non-communicable disease agendas, and we also have to integrate prevention into primary care, secondary care, etc. As you say, and we've not done that nearly well enough. I think it's part of a package of measures. So we have a very different question here from Richard Simpson, which I'm hoping hasn't been raised yet. This is back to COVID. So the Governor Cuomo made a point of extending community testing to deprived and also higher risk communities, including Hispanic communities. So I guess the question from Richard there is, you'll know a lot about our testing system in Scotland, Naveed, in terms of the groups that are being prioritised. Community testing is now being rolled out. Should we be doing more testing in high-risk communities?
Simple answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, how else are we going to know how this thing is spreading? Absolutely. And as you saw, I don't know if you saw, Linda, but clearly the places in Glasgow that have got the highest death rates are the poorest communities. You know, it's just kind of, we should be testing everybody, as many people as we possibly can, as much as we can, and repeatedly to really understand this, you know, this spread, so that we can really make better implementation of things to slow this. Absolutely.
And I don't know whether you've been asked the question yet about weight stigma. Has that come up yet?
No, it hasn't, but it's a very good point. And actually, so this piece we've written about includes comments about weight stigma, and we didn't want to cause stigmatize, you know, forget that. My grammar's not that good, actually. So I grew up in Blantyre, for those of you know, that's no excuse. So the key point here is what people understand. I really understand it because I got a chance to write, you know, lots of stuff about obesity, and I wrote the ABC series 10 years ago. I was just cutting my teeth on obesity then. And what I started to realize, and even in clinical practice, I see people don't want to be obese or you know, or even overweight. They just don't, you know. And it's 99% of people have tried their best not to be what they are. Okay, maybe there is a 1 or 2% who just don't care, but most people don't want to be. So what we need to do is actually empower people with understanding of 1 or 2 small changes, and also to embrace them to try, and also embrace failure. At least try, and don't worry about failing, and don't give them a hard time, really. I would love to be able to get, and we've put that in our little pieces. Here are the things, explain things in a way that they really understand without being patronizing. Get them to try a few things. If it doesn't work, try a few other things. And don't worry. Tell them we'd love you to lose, but tell them not to worry, that if they're not successful, we're not going to give them a hard time. So that at least encourages them to say, they're on our side. We're part of a team. Let's try it. You know, it's, you know, that, you know, do you know how, and one other thing I would say, Linda, there's a lady called Kath Barnard who's a professor in diabetes and psychology. She did a brilliant talk on another webinar. Just even a smile to patients, and just how we engage, and that actually we're a part of a community where, you know, I am not talking down to you. I am part of your team, and, you know, not part of your team, that we are, there's a humanity here, that we're friends together. Let's try and help each other to help. Do you know what I mean? It's really important. And I think we need to improve our education, how we communicate with people, really do.
Yeah, and unless we address stigma, people become more marginalized, and then barriers come up, and there's all kinds of problems with achieving change.
Yeah,
so another question here, which shifts back a little bit to policy, which I know you have touched on, but you will have read about the fact that the Food Promotions Bill in Scotland has been temporarily shelved. And that was the bill that was going to introduce restriction on multi-buys in the Scottish context ahead of the UK government. So we've got a question from Lauren White here, who's in my group, and she's saying that how do we move forward with government, trying to encourage them to think about the commercial determinants of health and those population policy changes at a period where we're facing a potentially huge economic crisis. So it could go one of 2 ways. Government has intervened hugely in people's lives as a result of the pandemic. Will they be more or less willing to intervene as we come out of this period?
Yeah. Well, I think you and Laura are probably better placed to answer that, Linda. I don't know, but, you know, clearly, you know, I think we have a choice to make in this point in our lives, don't we? You know, going forward for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Part of the reason this pandemic has hit us so bad is because of poverty, because of deprivation, because of poor education. And we're not going to be a poor nation like some of the nations around the world after this pandemic. We're still going to be reasonably wealthy compared to many. So I think we could still make improvements as we go forward. And I think the government needs to take a real big look at this. I would love to sit around with lots of people, I mean, it's not going to be me, but other people, really start from a whiteboard and think, well, how do we improve things? I think they should really grasp the nettle now and think, actually, do we want the nation to continue as it is, or do we really want to tackle poverty? Because we've been talking about it for years. And what's happened? Nothing, or very little. I don't think things have improved at all over the last 25 years. And, you know, the gaps have widened. So education, I think, is part of it, and how we work with the food industry. The food industry needs to make a profit, and it still can, but we can work it in a way that they can still make a profit, yet still provide healthier food products and less unhealthy food products. I'm sure they can.
Yeah, and as you rightly pointed out in your talk, all these underlying risk factors, deprivation being a key one, are things, and also inequalities in terms of ethnicity and the experiences those communities have. I think COVID brings home some very stark lessons there. Absolutely. And this obviously is not just for Scotland, but all countries, actually. You can see those inequalities. So I'm going to draw it to a close now. I know there's still a few questions that colleagues would like to ask, and we'll have a look at those and see if if we can send any of them to you. I will just mention that we've had Lucy Westerman from the NCD Alliance on the webinar, and I know they'd be very keen to follow up with you. Their global discourse both on overnutrition and malnutrition I think is really relevant to this topic, and I'm sure they'd like to discuss that with you in more detail.
I'm very happy to speak to anybody at all. I think this whole area needs major discussion. Hopefully this pandemic, maybe there's a silver lining, has taught us that we need to think more about obesity now. Maybe even the government is getting it now, actually, down south. But
yes, well, our Prime Minister said he wants to tackle that agenda. Right, I'm just going to say a few words, if you just stay on the line, about the next webinar. So Susan, if you could bring up the screen, please, the slides. Thank you. So colleagues, do join us for the next couple of weeks if you're able. Next week, you'll realize, if you've been following what's been happening in Latin America, that the pandemic seems to be particularly stark in some countries, including Brazil. So we're going to hear from two colleagues, one from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and the other one from the University of Talca in Chile, about their experience to date. So please join us for that. That's on the 14th at 2 p.m, a later time because of the time difference. And then on the 3rd of July, really delighted we'll have our colleagues from South Africa, again a fascinating country, as I've mentioned before, both in terms of their response but also their temporary ban on alcohol sales that's now being lifted. And just a word, we're then going to pause the webinars after the 3rd of July until the middle of August. We're certainly intending to have one on ethnicity and COVID when we reconvene in August, so do keep an eye out, and I'm hoping by July the 3rd I will have secured the first August slot, so you can put that in your diaries. So just remains for me to thank very much Professor Sattar for an excellent webinar. Apologies I dropped out for a short period, and then also all of you who've joined, and thank you very much again for your engagement and questions. And